Today is July 7th, 2010. I am Karen Aronson. We are talking this afternoon with Donald R. Sadoway, the John F. Elliott Professor of Materials Chemistry in the Department of Materials Science and Engineering. His research focuses on the use of energy and resources, and on questions like how to store energy in automobiles and in stationary objects, and how to extract metal ores and recycle metals. He is also one of the most popular and most heralded teachers in the Institute and has won repeated awards for his teaching, including the MacVicar Faculty Fellowship. He teaches 3091, Solid State Chemistry, a course that can be used to fulfill the Institute's chemistry requirement. More than half of the freshman class take 3091, a course sometimes referred to as 309 Fun. More students take this course than take the chemistry department's own offerings. Don, thanks for talking to us this afternoon. Students rhapsodize about that course. On the admissions blog, one student said it was the greatest class he had ever beheld, and that you fully deserved your five-star ratings on YouTube. An alumni posting about you and your work carried the heading Sadoway the Magnificent, and Bill Gates thanked MIT officials for putting your course online and told a Seattle newspaper that your classes were, quote, unbelievable. What's your magic?
I think I begin from the perspective of trying to imagine myself as 17 or 18 years of age, sitting in one of the seats in 10250 hearing this material for the first time, and proceed from there. And I have recordings of the lectures, and when I prepare a lecture, one of the first things I do is to view a recording of that lecture as it was last given. And I'll sit, and it's probably been almost a year since the last time I thought about that material. And I'll watch that lecture, trying to imagine myself as 18 and raised on MTV and Sesame Street and whatnot. And you know, when I was a youngster, there were times when my father would be watching television and there'd be some politician holding forth, and all of a sudden I'd hear my father yelling at the TV as though the person could hear him. Well, history has a way of repeating itself, so sometimes I'm watching the lecture and I start yelling at the TV saying, no, you can't go from that step to the next step. You left something out. And so I think part of that preparation is being able to look at what has gone forth in the past and try to tune it even further. So,
is it hard to put yourself into the shoes or the mind of a 17-year-old? You probably weren't raised on MTV.
I wasn't. I have 3 kids that were, but I guess you know, to the extent that I can imagine what it would be like to try to make the transition from home to college, and it's really a double jump because you're not going from high school to college, you're going from high school to college to MIT, and as you know, MIT is it's a big jump. And so I try to imagine what these students are bringing with them in terms of preparation. Some of them have had several years of chemistry in high school. Others took no chemistry. And so we've got a very wide range of abilities and preparation in the room. And the first month is difficult. It's hard to bring the first-time learners along without boring to tears those that have seen the material in high school at sort of AP level. So it's almost like Sesame Street in there, that you've got the basic message, the very most rudimentary lessons about electronic structure and bonding, and at the same time there's some deeper material, sort of, you know, when you're watching Sesame Street, there's the double entendres that only the adults understand. But it can be done. You have to be able to teach to a heterogeneous mix when you're teaching a freshman class because of the wide range of abilities of the students that come in. They're all smart, but not everybody's had the same preparation.
Did you ever have any teachers who taught like this?
Well, no, I did not.
And what got you thinking that this was worth doing, that it was something that you wanted to do or needed to do?
I think that back when I was still in high school, something about teaching, and I've always valued education. I've always felt, I'm first generation to complete college in my family, and education was always viewed as the key to social mobility, economic prosperity. And I always valued education. I had respect for my teachers, and I saw it as something that is maybe I'd like to do that too, and spread wisdom to the extent that I could. And so when I was in high school, I thought, well, maybe if I go to college, I could come back and teach high school in Oshawa, Ontario. And then when I got to college, I said, I like this. Maybe if I go to grad school, I could be a college professor. And so somewhere along the way, I got the urge to teach. And when I got to MIT, I just felt that over time that there was a need in the big freshman classes. When you look at the hierarchy of people around here, people dote on their grad students because the grad students are the partners in the research enterprise. So everybody wants well-educated grad students because well-educated grad students will perform presumably high-quality research. When you look at the undergraduate students who are in the major, well, if I'm in the material science department, material science majors are going to go out into the world with our brand. So obviously we want to make sure that they are the best material scientists at the bachelor's level that people can hire. But what about the freshmen? They're unspecified. They haven't chosen a major. Who cares about them? And yet if you think about something like in an analogous situation, child rearing, the most important thing you can do to ensure a strong finish is to get them off to a good start. And yet what do we do in education? People play spin the bottle to figure out who's going to teach the big freshman classes. So I saw a need and I decided, well, let's get in there. And it's a challenge, but the ripple effect is huge. So I guess it's been the right match of my urge and some institutional need.
Were you always such a good teacher?
I have no idea. I mean, I suspect things have gotten better over the years. I hope they haven't gotten worse over the years. I would say no. I would say that I've learned a lot over the years from partly from watching myself on video, but also by watching other people. I was fortunate that I was a recitation instructor in 3091 when I first came to MIT and hired onto the faculty. And my predecessor, Gus Witt, was a fantastic mentor to me. And really, I learned a lot from him. And it wasn't formal. I mean, he never sat me down and said, look, this is what you need. I was just watching him. He had this incredible ability to speak in 10-250, and I'd sit at the very back on occasion just to get a sense of the auditorium and feel what the students must be feeling. And he spoke to people not as though he was holding forth in lecture mode. It was conversational. And I say that, Gus he was able to create the illusion of having a one-to-one conversation with 450 people. And I thought, that's different. And to an 18-year-old who's used to being at the top of the totem pole, now to be at the bottom at MIT quaking in their boots because their support network's gone. They're now miles from home and they're not sure they're going to make it here, to have somebody talk to them as though they're real people, I think is an important piece of it.
Do students who love a course necessarily learn more and retain more? And have you tried to measure that?
I think that the answer is yes, because these are bright students. In many instances, I don't think I teach them anything formally. I just tell them what's on the agenda. And my number one role is to inspire them to learn. They can learn it themselves, but you know, when they come to MIT, they're all good in math. Physics comes pretty natural. It's 801 is Newtonian mechanics, and we all know the Newtonian world. Every one of us knows that if we throw a ball with a certain amount of force, we anticipate what the outcome is going to be when that ball hits another ball of a similar mass. Biology is fascinating. It's the new science, and with the rapid advances over the past 25 years, people are fascinated to learn more about biology. And then there's chemistry. That's the subject everybody loves to hate. It's the one that was most poorly taught in high school. So that being the case, if my assumption is correct, my number one job in there is to get them to love the subject matter enough to crack the book. After that, they'll learn the material. And so much of what I do in lecture is to engage them, to get them hooked on the subject matter, so that my goal by the end of the semester is to have them reflect upon their first experiences at MIT and go home and say, you know what? I hated chemistry in high school, but chemistry was my favorite class in my first semester at MIT.
Do you think that the skills to be a creative teacher are the same as the skills to be a creative researcher, that there's something that is similar in both cases, or are they really different kinds of creativity?
I think they're different kinds in many respects. The business of being inventive in the laboratory or in the desk, at the desk, I think that's quite different from being creative in a classroom setting. And here I'm talking about big class. I think we could divide the teaching enterprise into small classes, say classes of 30 or fewer, to the auditorium, where you've got, once it's more than about 100, it doesn't matter if it's 500 or 1,000, it's just a sea. And so how to put that subject matter across? It's not about finding the person who has the deepest understanding of electronic structure and bonding. There are people that know far more chemistry than I'll ever know, that you wouldn't set loose in a room with a bunch of 18-year-olds, even 18-year-olds at MIT. Because the communication piece that's the most important piece of good teaching. It's not the same, to my mind, same part of the brain as being inventive in a laboratory setting.
I was wondering if one needed to have a theatrical gene to pull off classes the way you do, but it sounds like you're describing it partly as a communications issue more than a performance issue, or is it the combination?
It's a combination. It's a combination. I'll tell you why. The performance is important insofar as you've got, as I've mentioned, you've got a large number of students, and beyond about the 7th or 8th row, the lecture is just a tiny visual piece of the entire panorama. So all you've got really is your voice. Maybe you've got some broad gestures, but you've got to work at engaging them, to hold their attention, because ultimately it's just a man with a piece of chalk. I can't go in there with a rock and roll band and all sorts of video playing in the background. That will trivialize the class. It'll make it into a parody of itself, because it has to be serious. The students, above all else, have to respect the instructor as a teacher, and how to engage them using legitimate theatrical tools, if you will. I think that's important. But I've always maintained that content trumps form. If what you're teaching isn't valuable or isn't seen to be valuable, they will turn off.
One thing that seems to catch students' attention, though, is that you bring history and art and music into the classes. When and why did you start doing that?
Well, there's different answers to different parts of that question. So the history was always part of 3091. I recently asked that question. I can't remember. I was preparing a lecture about 3091 at some point in the not too distant past, and so I went to my colleague Tom Eager, who was an undergraduate here, and he eventually became my department head for a 5-year period in the last decade. And so he was here at the time John Wolfe launched 3091. And it turns out Wolfe was quite a raconteur. He was originally from Germany, came to the United States, and Wolfe knew a lot of these people. He knew Friedrich and Knipping, so he could talk about X-rays and the Braggs and all of this stuff. He knew Heisenberg, and being a raconteur, he wove these stories into the fabric of the class. And then there were a number of people that taught, and then Gus Witt took over. And Gus was also European. Gus was from Austria. And you would have thought someone from Austria would have been very stiff and formal, and yet he was warm and he was charming. And he had this delightful Austrian accent, and it was Shrio 91 and Niels Bohr and so on and so forth. And he also had, I mean, he talked about going to a camp when he was a boy, in Schrödinger, who was also Austrian, was at this camp and so on. So it became natural to tell these stories. And I think for me, that was an easy way to engage the students. Instead of a litany of facts, and then this equation begat this equation, which begat this equation. So what did people think about the atom? What was the state of affairs in, say, the late 19th century? So there's J.J. Thomson, and then along comes some new data, and then Ernest Rutherford, and then Niels Bohr comes from Copenhagen to study with J.J. Thomson, and then with Rutherford, and then their grad students go on to here and there, and pretty soon it becomes a narrative. And so it's almost like it's a 14-week soap opera, and you come back for the next episode. So that was natural, and I've expanded upon it because I realized that a lot of these students, they don't understand the place and the time. So that, you know, why is it that there was all of these Nobel Prizes coming out of the Cavendish lab in the UK, and then quantum mechanics comes from Central Europe, and then the Nazis come to power, and you have Jews leaving Europe and people who are disgusted with the treatment of Jews leaving Europe, and then you see the ascendancy of American science. It's a powerful story, and why not tell it to freshmen? And they get it. It's terrific. Now the music is something different. The music was, when I was first invited to take over 3091, Gus wanted to rotate out, and so we reversed roles. So in the fall of '95, he took recitations, and I became the lecturer in charge. So I was thinking, as I was preparing lectures, that on the day that I teach hydrogen bonding, I would maybe play Handel's Water Music. And so I was thinking about that, and then it occurred to me, well, why only on that day would I play music? And so on the opening day of the lectures in the fall of 1995, as the students were coming into the class, I had, I think it was a Bach Brandenburg Concerto. I think it was number 1, and it was playing. I thought it was very sort of, you know, it was Baroque, and I thought it would sort of be, you know, sort of Cambridgey, and then I think there was something by Sheryl Crow at the end, because I talked about cars, and there was a Sheryl Crow song that's talking about people in a bar on a Tuesday at noon, and the good people of the world washing their cars and so on. And so then it became a challenge for me to make the match between the subject matter and the music. And then from there came film, and when I taught polymers, introduced the clip from The Graduate, and then came the Michael Frayn play Copenhagen, and then on and on and on, and pretty soon, I was bringing in artwork from Dali, and it all enriched the class, and the students loved it. So I think that's a long answer to your question.
Yeah, that's interesting. How many of the students are familiar with the works you present? Is this a pretty well-educated group, or are most of these things new to them?
You'd be surprised. I mean, when I teach five-fold symmetry, I play something with 5/4 time. So I'll have something like Take 5 by Dave Brubeck. And the students will come down after the lecture, and different students respond to different stimuli, but whenever I play Take 5, there'll be several students will come up to me after and they'll say, there's this one and it's got 5/4 time, or there's that one and it's got, or you could play this one, or you could play that one. So, they're getting it, and then sometimes I'll show something in film or what have you. They respond.
So it's a way of actually opening communications with students in different paths. I mean, it's not just talking about chemistry per se, but about music and art.
Absolutely, and I think it's important for me to model that I value music, I value art, I respect history, so that they see that I'm not simply the chemistry guy. That I too have. I'm not a shallow, one-dimensional character. I have multiple dimensions. How shallow or deep I am, we can debate. But so I think it's important for them to see that. I'll tell you a cute story. There was when I teach X-rays. One of the lectures. There's 3 lectures on X-rays. There's generation, their characterization, and then how they're used in examining materials. X-ray diffraction analysis. So on the second lecture, I play the opera aria La Mamma Morta from Andrea Chenier, and I use the version that's one of the recordings of Maria Callas. And so she finishes, and then I ask this, so what were we listening to? And of course they said, well, opera. And I said, well, which opera? What were we listening to? And then I tell them about the Verismo style. And why do we play this? Because Giordano wrote Andrea Chenier in the fall of 1895. And it was premiered in the spring of 1896 at La Scala at precisely the same time that X-rays were taking the world by storm, because X-rays were first discovered by Röntgen on November 8th, 1895, and so these are 2 parallel times. Okay, fine. And then I tell them, if for those of you who hate opera or think you hate opera, go and listen to this. This is opera for those of you. So anyways, after the final exam one year, this young lady comes to me and asks if she can claim her final exam. I give them back their finals if they want them. So we go down the hall to this room where I had the exams in a file cabinet, and I'm standing there flipping through She says to me, I've been listening to Andrea Chenier. And I said, that's great. So you love opera? And she says, before you played what you did, I had never heard opera. So here's a young lady who was obviously good at math and science in high school, somehow ends up at MIT, somehow ends up in my class. What's the most important thing I taught her that fall? She has a latent interest of opera, and she'll have that for the rest of her life. Now that's worth the cost of an MIT education, I would say.
Did you ever think about pursuing a career in the humanities rather than science and engineering?
Yes. When I was in high school, I loved language. I grew up in Canada, so of course we learned French, but I also studied Latin. I loved Latin. I was thinking, I distinctly remember studying the University of Toronto course, what they call calendar here, the course bulletin, and looking at classics. And I also seriously contemplated music. But then I decided applied science. I didn't like engineering. The word engineering didn't sit well with me. But mercifully, at the University of Toronto, what we have here is the School of Engineering. There is called the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering. I said, I want to be at the cusp of science and engineering, applied science, and I thought that was good. So.
Did you have a music minor or anything like that?
No. I took piano lessons as a youngster and so on. And
if you find exactly the right piece of art or music for the course, do you then keep using it, or do you keep turning them over? It sounds like part of the fun is to find new matches.
It is. There is some change, but in some instances, if you have a really nice match, I just leave it in place.
It's sometimes said that being known for spectacular teaching is the kiss of death in a research institution. But you won tenure and you've made it to full professor with a named chair. Do you think there are real trade-offs?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's only so much time in the day. And so but you see, the career spans decades. So, the way I handled things was I dedicated myself to my teaching, and even at the beginning, but I was teaching a core graduate class in material science, had about 40 students every year. In the spring and in the fall I'd take recitation in 3091. That still allowed me enough time to develop a research program that was strong enough to cross the divide and make tenure. But after I got tenure, actually, I really took a big step back and reoriented my research and reoriented my teaching. In other words, saying that, okay, so now that they've agreed to keep me, now I'm going to parlay the security that tenure offers into a wholesale remaking of what I'm doing, both in teaching and in research, in such a way as to take greater risks. So, if I fail, it's not going to be, well, this person isn't worth keeping here, but rather, we've already established that he's made the cut, but let's really reach for something that's greater.
Do you have advice for young professors about how to think about the balance between teaching and research, or advice on teaching generally?
Sure. I would say that you got to make sure that the research is that the research products are strong enough that you will be able to advance your career, and those are words that are carefully chosen. It's not that Caesar's wife must be virtuous, she must be seen to be virtuous. So whether that means you've got to publish your results, or you've got to get out into the world and be seen at conferences so that your reputation will grow. And then as far as teaching, be attentive to your teaching. Do a good enough job that you can get. See, the nice thing about teaching is that you can get almost instant recognition, because the semester ends, course evaluations are available within typically a month. And so I tell junior faculty, do a decent job when you first set out, because you'll get a quick feedback and you can be instantly recognized as, well, at least she can teach, that's good, now how's her research coming? But then don't go overboard with, don't be obsessive and say, gee, maybe I could fix this. It's a balancing act.
Going back to the 3091 structure, you introduced a contest into the class at some point?
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that.
So at one point, rather early in the semester, I required them to memorize the periodic table. When I first announced this, some of my colleagues called me up and said, are you mad? I thought rote learning went out with the Victorians. And I said, I think every educated person needs to know that cesium lies under rubidium. So I'm not going to ask them to learn the lanthanides and the actinides, but the S, P, and D block elements, yes. I'm going to give them a blank periodic table, and they're going to have to write the 1 or 2 letter abbreviations of those elements. So there was some grumbling, but we put it into play, and the students, they had 10 minutes to do this, and they were all done in about 3. As fast as their hands could write, they filled out all these things. And then there was a sense of pride associated with it. And then the subsequent years, they would tyrannize the new freshmen. Oh, you said I was going to make you learn a periodic table. And I said, and we learned it, so you can learn it too. So then, not to dismiss the lanthanides and actinides, I said, well, we'll have a contest for mnemonics so that you could name the lanthanide series or the actinide series. And so they'd give me things like lazy college professors never cease to produce a da-da-da-da. So lanthanum, cerium, praseodymium, and so on. And every once in a while you get a surprise. And it was sometime in the last 10 years, a youngster turned in an Elizabethan sonnet. The Elizabethan sonnet contains 14 lines. There are 14 F electrons, there are 14 lanthanides, and there are 14 actinide elements. And this was a piece that had 3 verses, 4 lines each, and a rhyming couplet at the end. And the first word of each line had the 2 letters either adjacent or sometimes with a vowel in between. I just remember for samarium he had smelting, and he knew I was a metallurgist, so. And I showed this to Janet Sonnenberg, who's on the literature faculty, and she got back to me a day or 2 later. And she says, "This is actually quite good." Oh, by the way, it was written in homage to the Shakespearean sonnet number 57, because lanthanum is element 57. I mean, everything was just neatly done. I've had some videos come in. This past year, a gal did a karaoke to the Sound of Music, doe, a deer, a female deer. She does the entire periodic table. I mean, they really get into it. And so then I have, during the Friday of the Parents' Weekend, when the parents are in town, I present the awards to the students. And it's great fun. And it just, I don't know, humanizes the class and makes it, it's not all work and problem sets and so on. And I don't think it diminishes from the learning, and it doesn't bring lack of respect for me that I've just turned it into a circus of games and stand-up comedy for me. I think there's a lot of learning there.
You have any idea what your poet is doing now?
I don't know. I don't know.
One other touch in the class that people point to is that you come dressed in a tuxedo for one of your classes.
Yes. This is the last lecture, the very last lecture. As you know, when the semester is drawing to a close, there are rules at MIT about homework assignments and so on. If there's a final exam, there can be no homework assigned during the last week. And that stretch from Thanksgiving to the end of the first semester is it's really difficult for the students. I mean, they really should take some exams and then go home for Thanksgiving and don't come back till New Year's or something. But anyway, so here they are, and so the subject matter, the very last major topic is phase diagrams. So I have a lecture on unary phase diagrams, and I bring in some liquid nitrogen, and we have some fun with that. And then the second lecture involves binary phase diagrams, and so we play with ouzo and water and so on. And then the last lecture I call my champagne lecture, because I teach them how champagne is made. And it relies upon the knowledge of 2 phase diagrams. One is ethanol water for the champagne, and then for cooling the neck of the champagne bottle, you have to know sodium chloride and water. So I show them both of these phase diagrams, and then we design the process by which champagne is made. And so I wear a tuxedo for that lecture, and I finish the formal part of the lesson, and then I talk about the final exam, and then I make some parting observations about the semester. And towards the end of that reflective part, I open the champagne, having taught them how to chill the champagne properly. So every 3091 student knows that there are 6 turns of the wire basket in order to take the cap off the champagne bottle and so on and so forth. I open the champagne and I drink a toast to the class. And I bring a bouquet of roses and everything. It's very elegant. And they remember. And they remember, I've had students come up and ask me about champagne. And is that so bad?
Sounds like you're getting into charm school before IAP.
There's an element of that, I suppose. I'm not going to push back from that.
You seem to like to surprise your students, too, to keep them off balance. One alum on some kind of blog was recalling a class that he took with you in chemical metallurgy.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't 3091,
Right.
In which you asked what was the most important variable in steel making. And apparently the students gave you all sorts of technical answers and tried to outdo each other, and you shook your head and you said, you drew a big dollar sign.
I turned to the chalkboard and I drew a dollar sign.
And why don't you explain?
Well, I mean, I can't remember. I think that was the year.
U.S. Steel.
Yeah. What happened was that there was a. Well, I don't know. Perhaps
Okay.
you've got some more information on it. I'm drawing a blank on the exact time.
Apparently, you said that if U.S. Steel stopped making money when they made steel, they were going to stop making steel. And this was a bit of economics being mixed
Right.
with the metallurgy. So, we had the arts, and now we have the social sciences.
Well, I think that, I guess the way I look at teaching is, so when I look at 3091, it's not a chemistry class, it's a chemistry-centered class. So the 303, which was the course number of this particular subject, was chemical metallurgy, but the students need to know something about the economics of metal production. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was perfectly legitimate to introduce this into the class, and they were fascinated by it, and evidently it stuck with this one fellow who managed to blog about it.
One of the Alumni Association websites,
Okay.
or something like that.
Yeah.
But
Well,
he was obviously struck by it, and he remembered it. It was some years ago. I don't know how long exactly, but there he was talking about yet another one of your classes.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to talk about your path prior to MIT. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? What were you like as a kid?
I was born in Toronto, and so my parents moved to Oshawa when I was 3 years old.
To where?
Oshawa, Oshawa. It's about I guess today it's about 160,000 people. In those days it was probably 50,000 people. It's the home of General Motors of Canada. So it's an auto town, blue-collar town, all of the feeder industries, glass, you name it, everything you need to build a car is in that area. And my parents owned a motel, small motel. And when I was first born, my father owned, he was a co-owner of a hotel in Toronto, but it was basically a tavern. And then he and his partner decided to sell and move out of Toronto. One of them went to Windsor, and my father went to Oshawa. The other interesting thing was that I didn't speak English until I was 3 years old. My parents were both of Ukrainian descent. In fact, my father was born in Canada. My mother came from Ukraine, and she was probably 2 years old. So they lived with my mother's parents at the time. So I spoke only Ukrainian. And when we moved to Oshawa, I learned English over the summer of 1953. It probably took me a couple of months to learn English, and then by the time I got to kindergarten, I was fine. You can tell I still retain some thick Slavic accent. Probably not. The interesting thing was I was in Ukraine in 1990, and a guest of the Academy of Sciences in Kiev, and there were some social settings in which people might walk in and not know who I was. And they would hear me speaking, and they would ask me would identify me with the region of Ukraine from which my grandparents came. So even though my vocabulary might shrink because I don't use the language, and after a week I could give a lecture on spectroscopy and molten salts. But the accent is pristine late 19th century Galician dialect, which is what my grandparents spoke. So anyways, I grew up in Oshawa, and not being of Anglo-Saxon extraction, growing up in blue-collar auto town, it had its challenges. I mean, when boys found out that I took piano lessons, I got the tar beaten out of me and stuff like that. So, I played hockey. Quickly came to the realization that my goaltending skills weren't good enough to get me to the Boston Bruins. Bobby Orr and I are the same age, and Bobby Orr was in high school in Oshawa at the same time I was in high school. So I decided if I were ever going to leave Oshawa, and boy, I wanted to leave Oshawa, I was going to have to study my way out. And so maybe that accounts for my love of education, because it really was the escalator, the social escalator.
Did you ever work during summers for General Motors?
Yes, I worked one summer in the purchasing department. But I did other odd jobs. I worked one summer installing swimming pools. It was hard labor. And then I applied to the University of Toronto and went into the program called Engineering Science, which was based on MIT. It was established right after World War II by some people who had studied at MIT. So I felt as though I got an MIT education at a Toronto price, and I was well served by it.
But it sounds like the interest in science and math was partly interest and partly practical.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. But I think I was influenced by teachers. I think if I sit here long enough, I'll recall some pivotal moment in high school where I said, science is really cool. That's what I want to do. But as we talked earlier, I could have gone into classics. I could have gone into music. So I think there may be a practical element. I think maybe my father would have had something to say if I'd told him, Dad, I'm going to go off to college and I'm going to study the classics.
You've never tried to make a better hockey stick, though?
I used to repair hockey sticks, though. I used to repair them.
Was the University of Toronto where the best students went?
Yes, in Canada, I would say, some people think McGill is good and so on. There are a lot of them around here, but I disagree. I think Toronto that was the place to go, and I was, as I say, the engineering science program there was really top-notch, and I think I got off to a good start.
What excited you about materials science and engineering rather than other types of science? In high school, I'd already started to take a shine to chemistry. Maybe because it's less precise. The math it's got to be right. And the physics could be mathematically modeled quite nicely, especially once you knew calculus. I mean, you could do all of Newtonian mechanics. But chemistry, no. Chemistry required some visceral sense, some intuition, and I liked that. And so when I went off to college, I thought I was going to major in chemical engineering. And in Toronto, still into the late 60s, it was the old MIT model. It was 2 years general, and then major in the third year. So we all had to take several semesters of chemistry, and one was organic chemistry. And I disliked organic chemistry. And chemical engineering in those days was largely petrochemistry. So where to find an expression for applied chemistry but not the chemistry of carbon? Extractive metallurgy. How to take ore and turn it into metal. And so that's how I found myself in what was in those days metallurgy. Materials science was just in its formative stages. But it was all
metallurgy with some parenthetical remarks about ceramics. But I knew nothing about polymers until I came to MIT, and semiconductors for that matter. I mean, my knowledge was basically metallurgy.
Good base.
It's a good start, but...
How much has the field changed since you entered it? And do you think it's changed more than most fields, or are most technological disciplines changing rapidly?
No, I think material science, perhaps biology is the only one that I could imagine has changed as much. And interestingly enough, I mean, what's the difference between biology when I was a kid and biology today? Today it's called molecular biology. Well, what is molecular? Molecular is chemistry. So it's now gone to its chemical roots. I mean, all this stuff about information and so on, absolutely fascinating. But what is the mechanism of coding that information? It is chemical bonds along the backbone. It is all chemistry. You know, Rutherford said, you know, he was very outspoken. He was a colorful character. He was one of 10 children that grew up on a sheep farm in New Zealand, and you know, they once asked him about, well, when you model the atom, you know, you've got the electron and you got the nucleus, and you've talked about the movement of the electron. You don't talk about the movement of the nucleus in your model. And he says, when an elephant has fleas, it's the fleas that do the jumping. And so you know, how to then, you know, put all of this together. Well, I lost my train of thought, so you have to bring me back to where I was. I knew there was some connection with Rutherford, but
we were talking about the change in the field.
So what I would do is, if I were to pay homage to Rutherford, I'd say, you know, parenthetically with reference to the comment I made about molecular biology, Rutherford said all of science can be divided into two categories, physics and stamp collecting. And so I would say he was close. I think it's chemistry and stamp collecting. So material science has changed a lot. It started with metals and metallurgy, the extraction, and then once you've got the virgin metal, how to combine it with other metals and alloys to get alloys with different properties, higher strength, higher toughness, what have you. But to make the metal at high temperature, you needed to know something about containment. So that meant bricks, which meant ceramics. So there was always an element of ceramics that went with metallurgy. And then in the 50s, when along came silicon as the lead material in what ultimately became integrated circuits. In the 50s, it was still transistors, discrete transistors. How to extract silicon? Well, silicon, even though it's a semiconductor, as a liquid, it's metal. And the production of silicon is metallurgy. And so there was this natural growth from metallurgy to the production of silicon and so on that then was, I think, sensible for the field. And then the analogy to alloy development, where you take aluminum and you add some magnesium, and next thing you know, you've got a metal that you can make beverage containers out of. Well, you start with a piece of silicon and you dope it with phosphorus and you dope it with boron. Well, that's alloy development. And so the analogy there brought semiconductors under the tent or into the tent. So now we've got metal, ceramics, and semiconductors. And then at MIT came the first successful attempt to bring in polymers. And the polymers up until that time had been largely handled by chemistry or chemical engineering departments. And that was about the synthesis of the polymers. But what material science had come to really become the primary expositor of is this notion that if you change the atomic arrangements, you'll change the properties. And so, well, let's do the same to polymers. So we can take high-density polyethylene and low-density polyethylene, chemical composition identical, but by changing the nature of the backbone, without changing the chemical composition, we get radically different properties. From the hard milk jug, you have the stretchable food seal, same material. So it was here at MIT under Walter Owen, who actually was the department head who hired me, that the decision was made that we're going to integrate polymers, and there were some, I'm told at the time, there were some old school metallurgists who bristled at the idea that it was too different and it wouldn't work, and of course they would make it their mission to see that it didn't work, and Walter made it his mission to see that it did work, and it did.
So you mentioned earlier that somewhere during college maybe you began to think about teaching college and remaining in academia. How did you begin to plan out your career or what you needed to do next?
I've never been very good at long-range planning. I think my career has been sort of a series of near-term adjustments. So, you know, at some point I decided, well, if you really want to teach college, you're going to need a PhD. So I continued in Toronto. I pursued graduate study because I was taken by one of my faculty in the undergraduate program there, and I ended up staying and doing a PhD with him. And then I realized that I couldn't go directly from a PhD to a faculty position. I needed to round out my education with a postdoc, and I won a NATO fellowship, which allowed me to go anywhere in the NATO alliance, and decided to come to MIT to work for the late Julian Zacchelli, who was really avant-garde in that he was bringing notions of how you model transport phenomena that were common to chemical engineers but unknown to metallurgists. And he'd only recently come to MIT. He'd been at SUNY Buffalo, and then I think around 75 had come to MIT as a full professor, and so I chose to come here to postdoc with him. And the plan was to spend a year or two postdocing with Julian, fatten up my resume, and then try to find a teaching position back in Canada. And while I was here postdocing, a vacancy came up on this faculty. And they were actually looking for a physical metallurgist, someone that would be involved in alloy design and so on. And Julian came to me and he said, I think you ought to apply for this position. I said, oh, no, this is MIT and so on. He said, no, I think you have some fine qualities, and just go ahead. You're being too Canadian, you know. Just. So I applied for the position and was offered the job. And so that's how I ended up here on the faculty.
What did you do your dissertation on?
My dissertation was in the chemistry of separation of niobium and tantalum. These are two elements that lie below vanadium. They're found together in nature thanks to the lanthanide contraction. They're chemically almost twins, even though they have rather different atomic masses. And there are certain applications, nuclear applications, where even though niobium and tantalum are chemically very similar, in a nuclear setting, they are poles apart. One of them has a very high neutron capture cross-section, and the other one has a very low neutron capture cross-section. And so if you're going to use these as alloying elements for parts of a nuclear reactor, you want them to be either opaque or transparent, but not a mix of both. And so I worked on a process to separate the two by forming compounds where the difference in the two compounds, the difference in the vapor pressures of the two compounds was enough that by fractional distillation you could get some reasonable separation efficiency. So the thesis involved preparing the compounds, measuring their physical properties, X-ray diffraction, et cetera, and then modeling the process. And
how did you choose the topic?
There had been some work in the lab that I was working in on zirconium and hafnium, which are both group 4 elements. And same thing, zirconium's transparent to thermal neutrons, hafnium is almost a complete block to thermal neutrons. And so I thought, well, you make zirconium niobium alloys, and so tantalum contamination in niobium would ruin the alloy, and so why not try the niobium tantalum chemistry? Plus I figured, wow, there's a wealth of information on the vapor pressure behavior of the chlorides of zirconium and hafnium. That ought to get me off to a roaring start. Turns out the chemistries of niobium and tantalum are very different from the chemistries of zirconium and hafnium. So it was a struggle, but I learned a lot.
And did you continue on that work when you got to MIT, or did you switch gears?
I switched gears. I think there was one small piece of follow-on work. I mean, it's normal for people when they're starting out, if there's some loose ends to still tie up after the PhD. There might be a little bit of follow-on work. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that. There may be some people that they continue to use their PhD as a platform for a long time. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. It depends on the topic. But I figured I'd said what needed to be said about the niobium tantalum, and then started to move into electrochemistry because I wanted to develop this whole area of the electrochemical extraction of metals. This is how aluminum is made by an electrolytic process. Magnesium is made by an electrolytic process. And I wanted to look at maybe extracting tantalum, titanium, and going farther. And also, in the late 70s and early 80s, there was still interest in the domestic aluminum industry and the fundamental electrochemistry behind the process. And so that was also a motivation to study the basic electrochemistry there.
Do you remember your first impressions of MIT?
Oh, yeah. I remember when I first arrived, and I walked up the steps from the crosswalk at 77 and looked up at those pillars and thought, well, you've really done it now. You know, this is it's high stakes. No more big fish in small pond. This is the real deal. So, yeah. And the early days were very heady. I mean, to be surrounded with super bright people, and I was postdocing with Julian, and the kinds of people that would come to visit him was just a different world from the University of Toronto.
Which is a major research
Yeah,
university.
and they were good people. We had good people there, and people came, but at MIT it was just at a different level. I think the biggest, one of the first things that impressed me was the number of industrial people that came to MIT. We didn't see quite so much of that in Toronto. Academicians would come, but the industrial connections here were quite impressive. And continue to be.
What do the industrial people come for?
They come for knowledge. They wanted to interact with the faculty because in those days American industry was still interested in understanding how their processes worked, interested in how to optimize their processes, and they were also coming to meet students because they were trying to get acquainted with some of the best minds that might down the road become potential hires. And they realized that one way to identify top students is to form relationships with top faculty who might say, I've got a really good student, he or she is going to be finishing in the next year. Sometime when you're out this way, you might want to swing by and take this person to lunch and get a sense of them.
And these are mostly people who work in the R&D arms of industry, or not?
Yes, mostly, but not exclusively. I mean, Julian hobnobbed with even the executive class, and he would tell them. He would tell them if he thought some of their decisions were ill-advised. He used stronger language.
And these were executives who had come up through the science and engineering ends of their companies and understood it, or these are...
Yeah, until probably the 1980s. I mean, if you were to look at, say, 1955, I'm willing to bet the president of U.S. Steel was a metallurgist, the president of Alcoa was a metallurgist. by 1985, I bet you could put a bar of steel and a bar of aluminum in front of the president of Alcoa, and he probably couldn't tell the difference between the two. So in those days, yes, the VP would be somebody who had come through the ranks of R&D and made executive decisions, but was interested in fundamentals.
And has there been a shift then in the types of executives or industrial people who come through? Are you seeing more people from other countries who place more value perhaps on the industrial production, or what?
That's correct. That's correct. I mean, the metals industry has shifted. There's very little basic R&D done in the United States. I'm hopeful that pendulum might swing back, but yes, we're getting visitors from East Asia, from China now, from Europe, from South America too.
And government, did people from DARPA or any other agencies tend to come through?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Absolutely. But also the policy arms of government. I mean, the year that I postdoced with Julian, he was engaged by the Office of Technology Assessment to host a conference for the OTA, and the topic was future of the American steel industry. And I was a postdoc, and so I ended up in a supporting role, which was ideal for me because I ended up, being, sort of the intellectual gopher, all right? And I interacted with these people that were coming from steel companies all over North America and from Europe. And it was exciting. And we had these government officials from Washington that were keenly interested in the outcome of this meeting, which lasted, I think, for a day and a half or something.
Did that become the major thing you did as a postdoc, or did you have other research, and how did you choose that?
No, I had research, laboratory research. Julian was his strength was mathematical modeling of transport phenomena, and one of the processes he was modeling involved it's a device called a tundish. It's a large cauldron, might be 60 tons of molten iron in it, and alloying additions are made to the molten iron. But you have to stir, and you can't use a spoon. So one of the means of stirring is electromagnetic induction. So there are coils that go around this cauldron, and the magnetic field causes the iron to go into circulation. And Julian had done some modeling of it. And remember, this was 1977. There were no personal computers. I mean, the equations could be written, but to solve them required pencil and paper. I mean, there were some mainframes, but I mean, you remember the card decks that this long. I mean, you couldn't. It was all here. So, anyways, I said to Julian, "Have you ever done any experiments to see what the flows might be?" So, I took my expertise from Toronto in high temperature physical chemistry, and married it to electromagnetics, and developed an experiment which we used copper tubing that was coiled around a beaker made of laboratory glass, and I melted some salts that, on melting, produce a clear, colorless liquid, and then looked at the effects of magnetic fields on how this stirred, because obviously you can't see inside liquid metal. So the molten salts have some conductivity that's intermediate between a metal and say water. Water, the conductivity is too low to give you meaningful results. So there was one paper that came out of that. It was fluid flow measurements in electromagnetically driven molten salts. So the steel making conference was one event, and think it happened in the spring, so by then I was fairly far along with my experiments, and it was right around that time that this faculty search was in full swing, and I think it's all a jumble to me now.
But it was fixed, right? You had a mentor who was pushing?
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. In fact, if anything, the department head, Walter Owen, who did agree to hire me, it was himself a physical metallurgist. So, I mean, the search clearly specified someone that was from the complementary side of metallurgy from me. So, I think I had some persuading ahead of me. Yeah.
But you succeeded.
Yeah.
How much has MIT changed since you've been here?
Oh, in some ways not at all, in other ways tremendously. So, I mean, when you walk down the infinite corridor, it's almost imperceptible. You'll hear alums come, who graduated in the 50s, and they say, oh, it's great to be back at Tech. Nothing's changed. You kind of wince. But other things have changed. I mean, I think at some level it's become more corporate. People are far busier. I used to have an office on the Infinite Corridor. I was in Building 8, Room 109, which is now an undergraduate teaching laboratory for material science. So I vacated my space in order to allow for the building of those labs, and I'm glad we have them. But in the early 80s, I would sit in my office and I'd have the door open. And, people would walk down the hall and sometimes pop in and just sit down, and we'd chat for 15, 20 minutes, and an idea would emerge. And now people don't sit with their doors open. And if somebody pokes their head into your office, you almost look at them and say, do you have an appointment? What are you doing here? So you're sort of looking nervously at your computer screen as I've got to get this done, and I'd love to talk, but...
You weren't that unusual back then in keeping your door open?
I don't think so. I mean, if I wanted to talk to, after I joined the faculty, my previous mentor, Julian Zacchelli, was still on the faculty. If I wanted to talk to Julian, I didn't phone him. I mean, we didn't have email. We had a black phone with a rotary dial. But I didn't phone him. I just walked down the corridor, made a left turn, started walking down the first floor of Building 4, and walked into his office.
So what's driving the change? What's behind it?
I think people are much busier. I think in those days it was easier to get funded, and the funding was longer term. So people were more relaxed about resource procurement and maintaining the funds that you need for a research program. Things were just a lot simpler. So people were, I think, more relaxed.
Do you think MIT's role in the world has changed much over the time you've been here?
That's a tough question. I mean, I think MIT always had this special role. It was a role of if you want an unbiased technical answer, you go to MIT. So, and I mean, certainly over the time period we're talking about, from the 70s, I can't talk about pre-World War II, but certainly from the 70s on, the whole business of spinning out technologies and playing an advisory role in government and even playing a role in government. I mean, we've had several people serve as Undersecretary of Energy, and going back to Bob Siemens, who was the first director of the Atomic Energy Agency, and so on. So MIT has always had a role to play, and a leadership role. So I think that's one of the good things that's remained constant.
Do you think your undergraduate students or graduate students have changed much?
Well, they've changed insofar as, there's a generational change. The Gen Xers are different from the the boomers, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the core is still there, this technology focus and, the high ambition and so on. I would say that perhaps today's students may become a little bit more well-rounded than the ones in the late 70s, early 80s. I think they were narrower.
And do you think that's intentional on the part of MIT and its admissions office, or I mean, you sat in on admissions committee discussions as a faculty member of their committee?
So I can only speak from the time that I was there, and from that time forward, I think that based on my interactions with the students in 3091, that we look at both the breadth and the depth, and people who are absolutely brilliant in their math or their physics, but score poorly on the personal index, have a difficult time of being admitted here. Now, I was not part of admissions going back to the late 70s, so I don't know whether the narrowness was simply a sign of the times, whether students going through high school ended up being channeled early and they didn't. I mean, I certainly had to study history and literature in high school, so I don't know, maybe these people missed a day of class or something. I can't explain it.
Or didn't retain it. Yeah.
Or didn't retain it, or somehow felt that it was not important. I can't answer the question. I can only tell you that this is the difference that I notice. You asked earlier about, when I talk about the music, the art, the literature, do they get the references? And by and large, they do.
I think something like 3/4 of them enter with fairly high-level music preparation experience. So I don't know about art and history, but the music is certainly there. Was it in any way difficult for you to make the move from Canada to the United States? Did you feel like cultures were very similar or not so similar?
There are a lot of similarities. I mean, remember, I wasn't coming from rural Canada to rural United States. I was in Toronto, and it's a large cosmopolitan city, and so coming to Boston, actually Boston's smaller than Toronto, so it's at some level I felt Boston was kind of compact, and but it was exciting for me. It was an exciting time. I mean, it was fresh, it was different, but enough similarity that I don't know. I think the main difference that I recall, and it's probably still accurate, is that I think in the United States there's a much more intense dynamic at work here in trying to understand what a democracy is. It's not as though it was established and it just runs. There's always something going on at the Supreme Court to try to settle, what happens if such and such. And I love that it's still in process. And sort of the corollary, you don't have that in Canada. And the other thing is the healthy sort of challenge or disregard, or I don't know how to put it, but there's the level of reliance on government in the United States is much lower than it is in Canada. You're talking to a Canadian because after about 15 minutes, at some point, a Canadian will say, the government oughta. In the United States, you don't hear that. And I think it comes from the heritage. America was founded in revolution against the crown. Canada was established in loyalty to the crown. I mean, the head of state of Canada is the Queen. When I was a child, the Union Jack flew from the flagpole.
You talked about the benefits of the corporate representatives coming through your labs and your departments. On the other hand, you also talked kind of in a more negative way about MIT being more corporate now. And I think there are two different things you had in mind, and I wondered if you'd elaborate a little on what you meant by the more corporate, separate from the corporate involvement.
Okay, so when I say corporate involvement, I mean the industrial involvement. So, engineering is stewardship of the Earth's resources. It's applied science, and so these are the people that make money by practicing the art. And so if I want to study the fundamentals of smelting aluminum, it would behoove me to interact with people that actually produce the stuff and sell it. And, if they have a bad day, they can't sell their product. It's different from me having a bad day and I got one of the homework solutions wrong, so we'll correct it tomorrow. So that's the sense that I mean the corporate involvement. So it's really the industrial practice piece. The corporate, when I referred to in a slightly negative way, is that the sort of formality associated with the structure of MIT. The thing one of the other things that struck me when I got here is it's flat as an organization. It's flat. People answer their own phones. I mean, I've had people phone me, pardon, and so I like to speak to Professor Sadoway. I said, you got him. I said, no, is Professor Sadoway? I said, you're speaking to him. I just can't believe you pick up your own phone. There was a time when mercifully, it happens very rarely, but there was a student in serious academic difficulty and was actually going to be expelled. And I was on a telephone, and I remember I was on a telephone call with a colleague of mine up in Halifax, and it was now it was about 85, 86, so we had the rotary phone, but it had two lines with the push buttons and the light glowing. So the second line was glowing. And I said, George, let me just put you on hold for a sec. I don't know what came over me because we couldn't tell who the number that was calling. Hello, Don? Yeah, it's Paul Gray. Paul Gray was the president of MIT, and he was phoning me because he was about to meet with this person who he was going to expel. And I was the person's registration officer and advisor. Now, this is the president of MIT, and he's phoning me. He picks up his own phone and he dials my number, and he waits for me to answer the phone. Any place else, there would have been a secretary, typically a woman, that would have said, Dr. Sadoway, I'm calling for Dr. Gray. Please hold for Dr. Gray. And then I wait, but not at MIT. One time I got a phone call when Jerry Wilson was Dean of Engineering. I pick up the phone, and he says, Don, yes, this is Jerry Wilson from the Dean's office. I said, you're not from the Dean's office, you are the Dean. And that's I love that about the place. Well, it's not quite as, there's now, if you look at how many vice presidents and assistants to the vice president that we have compared to what we had before, boy.
Does that affect your research or teaching much, or is it just
No. It affects my research because I think it ultimately it must have some impact on the overhead rate. But nobody cares enough about my teaching to bother me about my teaching. That's the other nice thing about teaching, is that I can do anything I want in that room as long as it's in good taste and the students don't go to Mary Row and get me on the carpet over it. I can do anything I want.
When you were a junior faculty member, how involved were you with the rest of the Institute beyond your department? Were you in a silo, or did you...
Yeah, I knew nothing. It was, after I became a tenured faculty member, I think I was starting to be tapped to serve on Institute committees. And then I started meeting people from all over, and that's a rich experience. There's some fantastic people here, and they're not all in my department. Surprise, surprise.
Literature and theater arts.
Yeah, exactly. But, in the Sloan School and the School of Science, there are great people everywhere.
On the corporate front, you were involved at one point in an interesting lawsuit involving magnesium.
Yes.
I don't know if you've done a lot of these lawsuits, but tell us about that one.
Oh, from time to time I get called to act as an expert in sometimes a patent infringement lawsuit. In this case, I was called by the Justice Department, U.S. Justice Department, that was acting on behalf of the EPA to prosecute a magnesium smelter that was in violation of the law, in huge violation. I mean, they were polluting. It wasn't even, what's the word? They weren't even hiding it. I mean, they were brazenly polluting. And they claimed that they had an exemption that was provided by the law. Well, they were in flagrant violation of the law. There was no doubt about it. And so, since I knew something about the primary smelting of magnesium, I'd studied it and published a seminal review paper on magnesium. I was contacted, and so at one point I had the chance to visit the smelter and walk through the operation and so on, and then be present at depositions where I was able to advise the attorneys working for the Justice Department what questions to ask of people who worked for the company. And there were a number of times during that period where I felt really good about serving the public interest. I mean, there was major damage being done to the environment on the banks of the Great Salt Lake and in the soil and the marshes abutting it and whatnot, and it had to be stopped. And all the lawyers in Washington couldn't have done a thing. They needed the technical expertise, and I think it's a legitimate activity on the part of a faculty member in the School of Engineering to serve the public interest on an occasion like this, and I was glad to do it.
About 7 or 8 years ago, your department chairman, head, who was then, I think, Subra Suresh, asked you to lead a committee to develop a new undergraduate curriculum in materials science and engineering. Why was that committee formed, and what did you do?
Periodically, we take a look. As I mentioned earlier in the conversation, material science has undergone major changes over time and continues to grow with nanotechnology and the merging of life science and material science on one axis. There are new opportunities for material scientists to act professionally, and we have to prepare our students accordingly. So a curriculum that looked just ideal in 1982 maybe looks a little bit out of place in 2002. And so my department head evidently had some respect for my judgment. I'd been teaching 3091 at the time and had some reputation for curricular innovation and so on. So he came to me and he said, "Would you lead an effort?" And he did it the MIT way. It wasn't democratic. It wasn't, let's get everybody into a room and take a vote. It was choose someone that you trust to do the job. And then he told me, he said, choose your team. He didn't say, and I'd like you to serve with X, Y, and Z. He said, pick 3-4 people to work with you, and then I'd like you to report to the general faculty by such and such a date, and turn me loose. And I said, well, what are the constraints? He said, none. I said, well, financial? He said, I'll worry about the money. You tell me how to teach this program, what should be in it, and how it should be taught. And so I got together with 3-4 of my colleagues that I thought were the most forward-thinking and capable. And I remember sitting with literally a notepad and a pen and drawing. I did this all graphically. Drew, okay, so then you go from here to here to here, and then we put the lab in here and so on. It was all time domain. This topic, and then this activity, and so on. and then brought it in front of the faculty. And long story short, one of my colleagues was tapped to, it was Carolyn Ross, who was tapped to actually implement the program. So Carolyn really put the program in place. But I was the one that did the initial sketches.
How different was it?
It was hugely different. I mean, the main difference was a high degree of laboratory activity. And what was different was, instead of having lecture classes that ran and lab classes that ran either in parallel or in a different semester, what I implemented was taking several of the key lecture classes, ganging them together, and then teaching that subject matter in a way that one faculty member knows what the other faculty member is doing. They move in parallel, and after 3 weeks they stop all lectures, and then it's an entire week of intensive labs that integrates the subject matter from the two classes. And this starts in the sophomore year, the first year that students are majoring in material science. And then they go back to the lectures, twin lectures, another 3 weeks, and then stop, and then labs. So it's this interweaving of the labs, as opposed to there's the lab class over there, and the lab class instructor's got his or her agenda and their struggles, and the lecturers are over here, and they talk to each other over cocktails at the Christmas party, but that's it. So this was really integrating to a very, very high degree, and yeah, that was the main hallmark of the revised curriculum.
It sounds very rational in theory.
Yes.
How does one rearrange other professors' lives and classrooms and so forth and make it happen? As you say, there was an implementation.
Yeah. Well, I think we there was a period of discussion, and we made sure that people had a chance to express themselves and voice criticism and express concerns. And to the credit of my colleagues, we got enough buy-in that if there is resistance, it's minor, and there were a lot of successes. So it's.
In putting your committee together, was it hard to find people who no?
No, they wanted to work.
To devote this much time to rethinking something this big that could backfire, or could have everybody shooting at them? No.
It didn't turn out that way. These were people that were younger than I am, and had recently either been tenured or had just recently made full professor, and they had a long run time, and they saw this as freshening up the undergraduate program in a department where they had a long run time. So at some level it was serving the department, but at some level there was a good deal of self-interest, the right mix. In other words, it wasn't pure altruism. I didn't expect them to just do this out of the good of their hearts, because they don't have all that time to give. But it was just the right confluence of, I guess, aligned interests.
What did it mean for the department? Did it do anything for enrollment?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you asked me earlier about, what was the motivation. I mean, I talked to I avoided the real truth. I mean, of course you have to take a look at the curriculum, but I mean, it wasn't just curriculum. I mean, there were concerns that perhaps people weren't devoting themselves to their teaching as students might expect them to do so. Enrollments were dropping. And it's hard to separate the drop in enrollment in material science from the ascendancy of the life sciences. The departments that were clearly places. Remember, we didn't have a biology major at that time period. The biology major. Forgive me, not biology. The biological engineering. Yes. So there was no biological engineering major at that time. So people were looking for, obviously. People would go into biology, which was School of Science, but if they wanted applied biology, they'd look at chemical engineering, course 10, or they might look at, there was a little bit in mechanical engineering, and we were slow to adapt, and so we were losing students. With all of these cases, I think there's both a push and a pull.
How did you work your way around that? I mean, the life sciences or biotech still exist, and yet you've seen enrollments grow.
Well, part of our strategy was to give students the tools they need to be active in the life sciences, and we successfully made the point that the life sciences today it's molecular biology, which is the chemistry of it, and we played our strongest trump card, which is material science is the font of knowledge that helps people understand how the manipulation of molecular architecture alters properties and performance, and even so in the life sciences. And obviously we've been successful because our enrollments are so high that some of the labs are struggling to accommodate all of the students. I mean, we have the problem of an abundance of success here. So,
have other materials science departments around the country done things like this, or were you at a leading edge?
I would say we were at a leading edge. After we developed this program, I remember giving a presentation at a materials conference, and there were other universities represented in this session. I wasn't the only speaker, so it was a session that might have had, I don't know, 5 or 6 presentations. And materials departments from other schools would present what they're doing in their undergraduate programs. And I can recall just being astonished at where they were in the evolution of the materials undergraduate programs. I mean, there were literally schools that were still teaching metallurgy and were proud of the fact that they were now broadening and doing some work in ceramics and semiconductors. I mean, they were where we were before the 1982 revision. That's where they were. So I think, but in fairness to them, MIT is special. The materials department here at MIT has enough faculty that it is capable of institutional completeness, and it can span the entire range of materials from metals through ceramics to polymers, the biomaterials, and have enough bench strength to do justice to those various divisions. When you have 35 faculty, you can do this. If you have 15 faculty, you can't. You have a concentration in semiconductors or a concentration in ceramics, but your undergraduates are expecting to learn about the breadth of material science. So it's very difficult for those schools to compete.
When you were talking about biotech before and molecular biology, actually, it sounded to me like if you were going to school today, maybe you would have been tempted to study that.
Oh, yeah. I'm fascinated by it. It's really,
Have you moved in this direction in your research?
No.
Because some material scientists have.
Yeah.
I think Subra among them.
Yeah, Subra has. Yeah, we've got a number of them. But I haven't, because there's something that fascinates me even more, and it's the social imperative. Maybe that goes back to why I thought chemistry would be my calling, is because I didn't realize it, but there's a latent interest on my part in what Susan Hockfield enunciated at her inauguration, which is science in service of society. And I think the biggest impact, just as I teach 3091 for the biggest ripple effect, the biggest ripple effect in research, in my opinion, today is not in the life sciences, it is in energy. And that's why I choose not to follow, even though I find it fascinating. It's more important that we develop a battery that can store the grid than unravel the human genome or something like that. And I'll say that to Eric Lander, and we'll have a laugh over it. But yeah, I respect their work. So tell us about
your quest to make a better battery. This has actually been a major research theme of yours.
Right. So I started battery research at MIT in 1994. There was none at that time. There may have been in a long, much earlier time, maybe before World War II, but to the best of my knowledge, there was no battery research. And it came out of the fact that I was teaching a class on technology and policy about air quality in the Los Angeles basin, and I was invited to give some guest lectures about batteries because electric vehicles might be part of the solution. And out of that experience came the invitation to go to Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan, and meet with the team that was working on an all-electric vehicle back in 1994. It was called the Ford EcoStar. It was a Ford Escort that had sodium-sulfur batteries. And I got to drive this car, and I came back from Detroit just absolutely elated. I grew up in Oshawa. I loved cars, grew up in a car culture. And this was an all-electric car, and it was fast, and it was silent. The only thing wrong with it was that the batteries weren't good enough. They were too expensive, and they weren't reliable enough. So I got back, I already made tenure, full professor, and so on. I was thinking, you're an electrochemist. Why don't you do something about this? And I started reorienting my research. I kept the metal extraction piece because I was, by that time, looking at environmentally sound processes to replace the carbon-intensive processes that are used to make metal today. So I wanted to keep that environmental piece going. But the battery, that could enable all electric vehicles. It could electrify our transportation system, reduce our dependence on import petroleum, liberate our foreign policy, provide well-paying jobs for Americans. It was win, 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 win. All we needed was a battery. So that's how I got started. And so I've continued to work on batteries for portable power. And then around, 3 years ago, one of my colleagues, Garrett Sater, came to me. Maybe it was 3 or 4 years ago. It was around the time they were forming the MIT Energy Initiative, and he'd served on one of the committees that was planning the initiative. And he's a colleague of mine from material science. He came to me and he said, there's a really big problem out there that nobody's been able to get their arms around, and that's grid-level storage. Because if you're going to, for example, ever see the day when solar or wind is going to become part of base load, not talking about augmenting. On a hot day like today, we need extra power, and if we're lucky and the sun's shining, all right, so the photovoltaics can help us. But what happens after the sun goes down? So photovoltaics, wind will never be part of base load unless we can capture that energy and have it available when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. I say with the right battery, we can draw electricity from the sun even when the sun isn't shining. Now that's a different set of constraints. The battery that goes in your cell phone needs to be idiot-proof because it goes in the hands of idiots. Battery goes into a car has to be crash-worthy, but a battery that's going to store the energy from a wind farm, it's not going to come into contact with the citizens. It's not going to be driving up and down the roads, so it doesn't have to be at body temperature. There's much more freedom in choice. We have to think about the problem differently. So about 4 years ago, I started thinking about grid-level storage, and now have a major research effort in batteries for what we call stationary applications, whether it's to provide power for a hospital if you go in a blackout, to do whatever is needed to keep the grid from going down, which could be things like load leveling, load following, frequency regulation, a host of different applications requiring batteries of different capability, but certainly different from the lithium-ion battery that goes in your laptop computer. So that's another area of research.
Do you have a time frame when you think it will be solved in some way? Is it a solvable problem, or is it just something where one gradually makes improvements, a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here?
I think history will judge that. I think that I'm hopeful that it's not going to be a long time, because I'd like to see it happen in my lifetime. And so I think it's going to require some breakthrough thinking, and I think we might have that in my lab right now. So we've got some cells that are cycling quite nicely, very exciting chemistry, and now we're looking at whether the idea is scalable. That is to say, we can build a small battery. Can we build a really big battery? And the reason we have to build a big battery is that all the batteries we know right now are built in units that were about the size of your hand or smaller. And so if we want to store the energy that comes from a wind farm or from the grid, we can't string together thousands of batteries, each the size of a soda can. The costs are prohibitive. So we have to start thinking about building big batteries the way we build an aluminum smelter. So this is the tie-in with my metal production. You know, you can take bauxite from one corner of the planet, petroleum from a second corner of the planet, cryolite from a third corner of the planet, put them into a smelter that has a capital cost of $5,000 an annual ton, and shoot 13 kilowatt hours across the cell to make a kilogram of aluminum, and it can do it for less than 50 cents a pound. Now, why can't we take the power, the economic power of modern electrometallurgy, and apply it to battery design? So that's the motivator behind this liquid metal battery that I'm working on. And if my hunch is correct, and we can scale up from the soda can to something the size of this studio that we're recording in, we change the world. Because then, imagine, you've got the ability to bring carbon-free methods of generating electricity into the grid as base load, and then in parallel invent a battery that's capable of electrifying the vehicle. So you electrify the transportation fleet, you decarbonize the grid. I mean, that's a new world.
How do you organize a lab to create breakthrough science and engineering? I mean, and do you wake up every morning saying, do I have a new idea to push this forward today? Or do you come into the lab and say, okay, you're the postdocs, you're supposed to be the hot idea producers? How does that all work?
It's my process. There may different people have a different way of doing it, I suspect, but I have a very flat management structure. I hire good people, and I give them a lot of autonomy, and I teach them. I teach them to think about the problem the way I think about the problem. Once I know that they understand the real problem, then I just say, you're smart, you can think your way through, and then, you know, we continue to have discussions, and I sort of coach them along. You know, the big breakthroughs, maybe that's my responsibility, and I'm the one that's got to get the money and the resources and so on. And then I say, you know, okay, so, you know, I'm the coach, but you're going to put the puck in the net, so if I can use a hockey analogy. You know.
Are undergraduates interested in this?
Absolutely. In fact, I hire UROPs, the undergraduate students, and I only hire freshmen, and I hire them out of 3091. And they're fantastic. They love it. And I've got 4 of them working in my lab this summer right now, and they started with me in the spring semester.
And do they stay with it for 2 or 3 or 4 years?
Some do, and others want to gain experience working with other faculty, and I encourage them to do so. I don't chase them out of my lab, but at the same time, if they want to get exposed to other faculty, I encourage them to get a UROP in a different lab.
Are there many other labs around the country and around the world that are now beginning to focus on battery technology? Oh yeah. It's
as the funding grows, you're seeing more academic research, and I find that positive, because we need a big community. It's a tough problem. It's not an issue to invent a battery. The issue is to invent a cheap battery. So this is the grid problem you're talking about? No, I'm talking about batteries for cars. So energy storage is huge. The original research plus the newer. Yeah. But it sounds like they were 2 separate projects, because they had 2 sets of constraints. Correct. 2 sets. Correct. They're very different problems. But they work next to each other? Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, our group meetings, you know, we got 25 people at a group meeting, and we learn from one another, and the metals extraction people learn from the battery people, and the battery people learn from the metals extraction. So, you know, I view it as sort of mental gymnastics. Just keep their brains working, and then all of a sudden one day they'll see ideas that are transferable and move from outside the field. You just have to put the right piece of music on. Maybe, maybe.
The physics department, coming back to teaching, has moved away from large lectures, saying that students weren't really learning well. Do you think you could have made physics lectures more effective, or is there something different about teaching physics and teaching solid-state chemistry?
Let's see. Well, there's two pieces to that answer. For the physics department has embraced this technology-enabled active learning. TEAL is the acronym. This was done at least 10 years earlier at Rensselaer. They called it studio physics, and you know, not every student has the same learning modes. Some people are visual learners, some are tactile learners, and some are capable of sitting for an hour and listening, and others get up and fidget and so on. So it doesn't surprise me that the physics department finds that some people learn by sitting at a table in groups of 3 and so on. I don't have that luxury, because if you're teaching Newtonian mechanics, you're dealing with inert objects that will impact one another, and you can measure velocities and so on and so forth, or electricity and magnetism, you can measure forces. You can't have studio chemistry. You can't have 9 people seated around a table with open vessels and chemical reactions taking place. So it's a non-starter. So people who talk about TEAL and say, you know, it's the way to go, I say, well, I can't use that information. Now, as far as whether people learn in big lectures, I would dispute that. I would say that some of the finest lectures I've ever seen were delivered by Walter Lewin, who was a lone individual with a piece of chalk. He used demonstrations. Right. And the students loved him, and I think they learned a lot from Walter. And so, you know, I don't want to say bad things about the direction that the physics department has taken, but I do believe that it still is possible, if you have a lecturer that's engaging and the subject matter is solid, that students will learn from a lecture format.
He's another teaching superstar. Do you and he ever sit and talk about teaching?
We've had kind things to say about each other. We'll see each other at some function, and we always end up chatting together.
Have you sat in on any of his classes?
I've seen his classes on video. And actually, he gave a lecture during IAP that I went to. His lecture was about his love of art. He's quite a collector, and he's very knowledgeable about the history of modern art. And it was a thrill to hear Walter Lewin explain the evolution of modern art. He's really a polymath, and I have a very high regard for him and a lot of affection for him.
So if you're going to keep lecturing, is MIT going to give you a lecture hall that you can love?
I think 10250 that's going to be the facility. Take it or leave it.
But it's not big enough to hold the crowds that want to attend your course.
These days, the number of people enrolled in 309 exceeds the seating capacity, and if the Cambridge Fire Marshal came there on a particular day, we might be in trouble. So, yeah, there is a need for something larger. We've solved the problem in the last several years by piping a video feed into a second room. And when I was originally told that this was going to be the case, I was saddened by the fact that students might have to sit in another room, but turns out that they self-select and they like going to the other room. There's about 50 of them go to the other room because in my class I won't allow people to eat or drink. And so I'm told if there are a few TAs that sit in there to make sure it's not pandemonium. And I'm told that students go there and they've got their coffee and donuts and
can talk to each other?
They're not allowed to make too much noise, but yeah.
So what would an ideal lecture room look like in
I think 10250 is
what makes that better than 26100?
The pitch of the seats.
It's steeper?
Yes. The 26100 is first of all, there's a gulf between the front row and where the lecturer stands, and then the lecturer stands on a platform that's about 2 feet high. And so the lecturer is looking down on about the first 7 or 8 rows. And then the ascent is very gentle. So the people are far, far back. And it's very broad, and it's hard to make eye contact. When I lecture, I'm constantly scanning because
10250 is deeper, I
yes,
think,
yes,
and less and narrower.
Right, and there's no gulf. So when I lecture, I have a wireless mic, and I can walk away from the board and to the students, and even walk up the aisle, and at times look at the board, and it's all part of trying to minimize the separation between the lecturer and the learner, and 26100, even though it seats 550 students, I find it I've lectured in there, and I find it hard. 10250 is, in its own way, it's intimate.
You recently turned 60 and were honored by your colleagues and students and former students. Tell us about that. I don't think I've heard of many festivities like that.
Well, this is something that comes from my research. I'm part of this community of people that study the properties of high temperature liquids that are commonly referred to as molten salts. And this community used to be strong in the United States, but since the 70s has been pretty much decimated owing to lack of research funding. I continue to soldier on, manage to figure out ways of getting myself funded here and there. But the dominant place for molten salt chemistry is Europe. And in Europe, they have a custom, at least the molten salt community does, when somebody notable in the field turns 60, they have a symposium in the person's honor. And people come for several days and give papers, and there's usually a banquet and other festivities and so on. So about a year ago, some people approached me and said, next year you're turning 60, why don't we have a symposium? And I said, no, I don't want to bother people and so on. Well, after some arm twisting, we agreed to have it, and we decided we're going to have it at MIT. And it turned out to be a smashing success. There were about 100 people came from, I had people from Europe, there was someone from Greece, from Germany, from the UK. I had a contingent from China, from Japan. In fact, the vice president of Tokyo University came. He happens to be a material scientist who had actually postdoced in Toronto at a different time from me, but we'd met on several occasions. I didn't know him very well, but he came and he spoke at the banquet and so on. So we had 2 days of presentations, and we held it in 10250, symbolically appropriate, and even got a video greeting from Bill Gates. So.
Have you met him in person?
Yes, he came to MIT in September of last year. I got a call from, actually an email from his secretary saying, Bill's going to be in town, he'd like to see you, would you have time to meet with him? And I said, I think I can make time. So he came to MIT, and I'd met him on the steps in front of 77, and we walked down the hall to my office, and we sat in my office for 90 minutes, and we talked about 3091, online learning, we talked about batteries, and so on and so forth. And then I saw him again when I was in Seattle for a metals conference, and we met again. So,
did any of the 3091 course or the work you were doing tie in with either his Microsoft company or with his charity, or was it just sort of, here's a guy who's broadly interested in the world and he stumbled across this and found it interesting?
I think it's the second case. Somehow he was introduced to something I was doing in 3091 and ended up watching all 35 lectures off of OpenCourseWare, and it was surprising to me because there was an interview conducted by the Seattle Post-Intelligencer in June of 2009, during the last month that he was actively serving in the company. And it was on the first paragraph of the interview. They asked him about next steps, what he's going to be doing, and about online learning and so on. And so he answers questions of the first two parts about what his plans are and getting involved in some ventures. And then out of nowhere, he starts talking about, yeah, you can learn a lot online. I've been watching chemistry lectures and Don Sadoway at MIT and on and on and on. And I was just astonished. People started writing me, do you know Bill Gates was talking about you in this interview? So evidently it made some impact on him. And then we've continued to talk about energy, which he's come around to seeing as a critical problem that maybe isn't getting enough as much attention as in his judgment it ought to get. So,
besides your class and the research, your classes and research, you seem to be involved in a variety of other activities at MIT. One of them is the annual debate in Kresge Auditorium over 2 Jewish holiday foods, latkes and Hamantaschen, and which is better. And you seem to be a great debater on both sides. What role does fun have at a serious place like the Institute? Do you think there's enough of it?
Well, first of all, I think fun has an important role. I think that we have to develop the whole person, and learning to laugh and learning how to make others laugh in a way that's not hurtful or offensive. You know, humor is very delicate. You know, just one little nuance in what was well-intentioned as a good-natured ribbing can be perceived as an insult, and it's practiced. And being able to laugh at ourselves, and I think it's all part of rounding out character. So when the students at Hillel approached me for the first time 4 or 5 years ago, maybe it's a little bit longer, but certainly less than 10 years ago, they were having this first debate and they wanted me to participate in it. Initially I balked because I didn't know what these foods were, but I consulted with the appropriate authorities and said, okay, let's go. And it had a ball. In fact, Walter Lewin was part of that first debate. It was absolutely hilarious, and everybody had a good time. And it's grown over the years to a large number of people. And I think that there's room for more humor. I mean, we do have the tradition here at MIT of hacking, and the hacks can bring a smile to one's face at a time of great stress. So I applaud the effort to introduce humor, and also it's good for the students to see the professors having fun. I mean, I think they need to see the human side, and so that's good.
Were the students who approached you ones who had taken your class?
Yes. Yes, somebody said, you know, when they were making a list, who would be appropriate, and they said, Sadoway, get Sadoway. So I was honored.
What's kept you at MIT all these years? It sounds like other people have gotten interested in your research and in your teaching.
Oh, it's the students. It's the students. I mean, there are great students everywhere. What's different about MIT is that the average student here is at a very, very high level. And I mean, it's just, it's a very special place. So I would say it's the students.
We're out of time. It's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you for an interesting and fun conversation.
Well, my pleasure.